What if I told you that the most powerful thing you can do for your insulin resistance has nothing to do with cutting carbs, skipping meals, or spending an hour at the gym? What if the single greatest lever you can pull happens in the first 15 minutes after you wake up, and most people are doing the exact opposite of what their body actually needs? I'm Dr. Ava Harper, and I've spent over 2 decades working with metabolic health patients, researching the intersection of circadian biology and blood sugar regulation. And what I'm about to share with you today genuinely changed the way I practice medicine, and the way I start my own mornings. Before we get into it, I want you to know something. If you've been told that insulin resistance is just about eating too much sugar, or that fixing it requires an extreme diet overhaul, you have been given an incomplete picture. And that incomplete picture may be the very reason you're still struggling. So stay with me, because the next few minutes could reframe everything. Let's start with the problem. The overwhelming majority of people dealing with insulin resistance are focused almost entirely on what they eat. And look, food matters, I'm not dismissing that. But here's what the research increasingly shows. When you eat and what you do in the first hour of your day can have just as profound an effect on insulin sensitivity as your diet itself. Most people wake up, check their phone, maybe grab a coffee with some creamer, scroll for 20 minutes, and then shuffle into their day. Some skip breakfast entirely thinking that's a healthy move. Others drink a large glass of orange juice because it sounds nutritious. And almost nobody, is doing the one thing that science now shows can reduce insulin resistance markers by up to 40%. That one thing is morning sunlight exposure combined with a short bout of movement, done within the first 30 to 45 minutes of waking. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Sunlight? That's it? That sounds too simple to be real. And I completely understand that skepticism, because we live in a world where we're conditioned to believe that health fixes have to be complicated, expensive, or painful to be effective. But simplicity isn't the same as ineffectiveness. In fact, the most elegant biological systems in your body operate on remarkably simple inputs, and your insulin signaling system is one of them. Let me tell you about a patient of mine. I'll call her Sandra. Sandra was 53 years old, moderately overweight, and had been pre-diabetic for 4 years. She had tried low-carb diets, intermittent fasting, metformin at a low dose, and various supplements. Her fasting insulin levels remained stubbornly high. Her HOMA-IR score, which is the standard measure of insulin resistance, was sitting at a 4.2 when we wanted under 2. She was frustrated. She felt like her body was broken. When I introduced her to the concept of circadian-aligned morning light exposure paired with post-wake movement, she was skeptical. But she was also desperate enough to try it. 8 weeks later, her HOMA-IR had dropped to 2.6. Her fasting glucose improved by 18 points. She hadn't changed her diet significantly. She had simply changed her mornings. So let's talk about the science behind why this works, because understanding the mechanism is what makes this feel real rather than magical. Your body runs on an internal clock, the circadian rhythm, and this clock governs far more than just your sleep-wake cycle. It directly regulates the release and sensitivity of insulin. Here's the key thing most people don't know: your muscle cells, liver cells, and fat cells each have their own peripheral clocks, and these clocks are calibrated every single morning by 2 primary signals. The first is light hitting your retina. The second is physical movement. When these 2 signals arrive early in the morning, they essentially tell every cell in your body, we are awake, it is daytime, and it is time to be metabolically active. Your GLUT4 transporters, the proteins responsible for pulling glucose out of your bloodstream and into your muscles, become more abundant and more responsive. Your cortisol follows its natural morning arc properly, peaks and then declines, rather than remaining elevated or dysregulated throughout the day. Your mitochondria upregulate their activity. Your pancreas becomes better coordinated with your muscle tissue. Everything clicks into gear. When you don't get that light signal, when you wake up and stay indoors under artificial lighting, staring at a blue-lit screen, your peripheral clocks stay confused. They don't get the "it's morning" message. And when those clocks are misaligned, insulin signaling becomes sluggish. Your cells are less responsive to insulin's instructions to take up glucose. Your liver continues producing glucose even when blood sugar is already adequate. This is insulin resistance, not just as a dietary problem, but as a circadian problem. And this is why the fix isn't only on your plate. It's in your morning routine. Now let me walk you through exactly how to implement this, because the details matter and I want you to get the full benefit. The first step is to get outside within 30 minutes of waking, and I mean real outside, not standing next to a window. Glass filters out a significant portion of the UV and near-infrared spectrum that your retina and skin need to trigger the circadian calibration response. You need to be under open sky. On a clear day, even 2 to 10 minutes is enough to trigger the photoreceptive response. On a cloudy day, aim for 15 to 20 minutes, because cloud cover still transmits meaningful amounts of the relevant light spectrum, far more than any indoor light source. And here's an important clarification: you do not need to stare at the sun. Simply being outside with your face oriented toward the sky is sufficient. The second step is to pair that light exposure with movement. And this does not mean you need to do a 45-minute high-intensity workout. What the research shows is that 10 to 15 minutes of moderate movement, a brisk walk, some bodyweight squats, even dynamic stretching, is enough to trigger GLUT4 translocation in your muscle cells. This is the process where glucose transporters move from inside the cell to the surface of the cell membrane, dramatically increasing your muscle's ability to absorb blood glucose without requiring as much insulin to do so. You are essentially making your muscles more insulin sensitive at the cellular level, and you're doing it before you've had a single bite of food. The third step is to delay your first meal slightly, not in the way that aggressive intermittent fasting advocates often promote, but strategically. If you're doing your morning light walk and movement, your cortisol is following its natural arc and your blood sugar regulation is in a more stable state. Having your first meal between 60 and 90 minutes after waking, rather than immediately upon waking or several hours later, tends to align better with your insulin secretion patterns. Research from the Weizmann Institute and from studies on time-restricted eating in metabolic patients both point toward early and timed caloric intake as more protective against insulin resistance than simply restricting calories overall. The fourth step is to make your first meal protein-forward rather than carbohydrate-forward. Now, I said this wasn't primarily about diet, and I stand by that, but within the framework of this morning habit, what you eat after your light and movement session does matter. When your first meal is anchored by protein, eggs, Greek yogurt, smoked salmon, a protein smoothie, your body's insulin response to that meal is far more modulated than if you started with toast, cereal, or fruit juice. Protein stimulates a modest, controlled insulin release, and it activates GLP-1, the hormone that slows gastric emptying and further stabilizes blood sugar. You're essentially giving your newly sensitized cells a calm, manageable metabolic challenge rather than a spike. The fifth step, and this one is often overlooked, is consistency. The circadian system responds to patterns, not one-time events. The benefits I've described, the GLUT4 upregulation, the cortisol normalization, the improved insulin signaling, these become more pronounced and more durable the more consistently you reinforce them. Even 7 to 10 days of consistent morning light exposure begins to shift measurable circadian markers. At 4 to 8 weeks, you can start seeing meaningful changes in metabolic biomarkers. This isn't a one-week fix. It's a daily reset that compounds over time. Now let's talk about the evidence, because I want to be very clear that I'm not asking you to take my word for this on faith. A 2022 study published in the journal Diabetologia found that morning bright light exposure in adults with metabolic syndrome improved insulin sensitivity markers significantly after 4 weeks compared to controls. Research from the Salk Institute on Circadian Biology has shown that circadian misalignment, which is exactly what happens when you skip morning light, directly impairs glucose metabolism independent of diet. A landmark study from Brigham and Women's Hospital found that circadian disruption caused insulin resistance increases of up to 32% in healthy adults within just 1 week. And multiple studies on exercise timing consistently show that morning movement has superior effects on insulin sensitivity compared to evening exercise, largely because of its alignment with the body's natural cortisol and glucose metabolism rhythms. What's particularly compelling is that this mechanism explains something clinicians have observed for decades but couldn't fully account for: why shift workers and night owls have dramatically higher rates of type 2 diabetes even when their diets are similar to day-oriented individuals. Their circadian signals are chronically misaligned. Their morning cues never arrive properly. And over years, that misalignment silently erodes insulin sensitivity. The good news is that this is reversible. The circadian system is remarkably plastic. You can re-anchor it. And the morning habit I've described is one of the most direct ways to do so. I also want to address something that comes up with many of my patients, which is the feeling that they've already damaged their metabolism too badly to benefit from something this straightforward. Sandra felt that way. Many of my patients over 50 feel that way. And I want to be direct with you, the research does not support that narrative. Even in patients with established type 2 diabetes, circadian-aligned interventions have shown meaningful improvements in glycemic control. The body's desire to restore metabolic balance is profound. Your cells are not waiting to be punished. They are waiting to be given the right signals. So here's what I want you to take away from everything we've covered today. Insulin resistance is not simply a dietary disease. It is a signaling disease, and your morning routine is one of the most powerful signal-sending events of your entire day. Getting outside within 30 minutes of waking, moving your body for 10 to 15 minutes, timing your first meal thoughtfully, making that meal protein-rich, and doing this consistently, this is not a hack. This is working with the biology you were designed with. And the 40% reduction in insulin resistance markers that the science points to? That is not from a pharmaceutical. That is from a walk outside in the morning light. I want you to try this for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. Notice how your energy feels in the afternoon. Notice whether your cravings shift. If you've been tracking your fasting glucose, keep tracking it. The data will speak for itself. And if you found this valuable, please share it with someone in your life who is struggling with blood sugar, prediabetes, or metabolic fatigue. They may not have heard this framing before, and it might be exactly what they need. Drop a comment below telling me what your mornings currently look like. I read every single one. Because small, informed, consistent choices are the foundation of lasting health. And sometimes the most powerful change you can make starts with simply stepping outside and letting the morning find you.